Music has always spoken to what is in the heart of people's challenges and what they're facing out there in the real world. Music was very reflective of the times, and so a lot of the music was around the war, was around sexuality, and I think in a lot of cases music today is also about those issues that young people have to face today. The poverty that's out there, the inequality, the racism, the economic system. But the one thing I'd say that's very different from today than when I was young is, in most cases, the music during my generation was usually against the man, the dominant culture. And what I see today is that's not always the case, that sometimes it is, but sometimes it's also against females. And females have been put in a position of being treated differently, and in a way that's very hurtful to me. I often listen to some of the lyrics that are described in music, and I find them very destructive. I find that very challenging to have to talk with young men about, is that music that you really believe or hear, or are they just lyrics? And looking at that, because that, I believe, is harmful to our culture. It's harmful to all our culture, of everyone there. And with the availability of the media now, right now, everything is so immediately can be put somewhere for someone to see. With all the social media outlets that are available and just the availability to anything at any time. It's at a moment's notice in terms of what happens. Whereas before, I think things kind of percolated for a while oftentimes. And I think with percolation, I think of it as groundwater going through the ground, that we filter out some of the things that come through it before it ends up at wherever it is at the end of the earth or the sandstone that it goes through. Whereas I don't think some of that percolation happens these days. It's immediately posted and done. And it has a different meaning. Sometimes we say things we maybe didn't intend.
And that's usually the case most of the time. People just say stuff just to say it, not even realize.
And there's also the shock value. There's also the money. I mean, there's lots of money. There's people who've talked about, and this has happened for generations. What music label did you sell out to? Who do they represent? Have you lost your roots from where you came from in terms of who you are as a beginning rapper, and now you're sitting over here with all your bling bling, and what does all that mean? Have you lost the cause and the people that you were fighting for?
That's right.
Well, I'm 42, and so what I think about growing up, it's a different generation. I mean, there's a respect factor where we were respectful to our teachers. And now I look at the youth is that there's no respect. There's a lot of attitude in the way they communicate with adults. Is not respectful manner. I think the language that our youth. I was talking about the language. Especially being a person of color, I get really frustrated to see our youth use the N-word. Whereas when I was growing up, I don't recall us using that word. And now kids use it so freely. It's not even just around just the black students are using, but the white students are using it.
Just about every race.
Race. And I don't think they understand the severity of that word.
And where it comes from, like the background behind it.
Absolutely. And how much people have shed tears and lost blood to gain respect, not to be called that. And that's just frustrating to me, just to see this generation of youth, lack of motivation to be in school, lack of motivation to want to work. I feel that this generation, compared to when I was growing up, feel entitled and don't have responsibilities. And so without having responsibility, I think they have a false sense of entitlement. Because me, being raised by a single parent on welfare, I went to school. I didn't get to do sports activities because I had to go home and help raise my younger siblings, my sisters. I worked at McDonald's when I was in high school, went to Benson. I didn't run the streets. I didn't go out drinking, partying, smoking weed. I didn't do all that. And now I think of my own daughter who's 16, it feels like she has to be in the in crowd, like being a follower. And I don't feel like she should be a follower. I feel like she needs to be a leader.
Right.
Leader of what to do, what's right, not to be following people who thinks it's cool to smoke weed, or who thinks it's cool to skip school, who thinks it's cool to disrespect adults. I don't understand. So
I think dropping out of school for teens is more like it's a very challenging hardship, emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So even though it's going to be an emotional challenge, knowing that most jobs won't usually accept teens without, finishing high school, even though they can work at probably a fast food restaurant. Later on in their life, they're going to want to continue, and they do have their GED programs, but
Right.
I know there's still some type of difficulty in the way. What do you think that possibly, how do you think that would possibly affect them later on, knowing that they didn't finish high school?
I feel as if they'll end up finding themselves as some type of dead-end job. It's hard to say that, maybe all throughout their life, saying, well, I can't really say all throughout their life, but for the majority, they're gonna, find themselves barely meeting certain things like, independence for themselves. And as far as that goes,
Something like that.
yeah, man, I dropped out once.
Oh, you dropped out once and what?
Dropped out
Okay,
once.
so you dropped out once. So what was that? What was that like for you in the like, what were you thinking about? What was going on in your head when you dropped out?
Honestly, it was my third high school. Every time I transferred high schools for the reasons of just moving around the city, and I felt so disconnected with, other students, teachers. Felt, loss of engagement with classwork and, communication with the other students in class and asking about work and things like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you think classwork, schoolwork, and regular life, you think that has to do with teenagers starting from either freshman year to senior year? Do you think classwork and social life usually has to do with them dropping out most of the time?
I feel like it, yeah, in some sort of extent that, kids find themselves, not really seeing the bigger picture, or maybe that they're seeing more of the bigger picture than the smaller picture. That, you've got to go through the work and, find themselves finishing school, finishing the credits and things like that, and seeing where they actually want to be at after high school, but instead they want to see themselves, way at the long run
Right.
of, later on in life. They're like, well, what does this have to do with this and that? Instead of saying like, after I finish high school, instead of saying like, oh, well, I'm going straight to college, but they don't know exactly what they want to do.
Right.
And then they find themselves at, some type of job that they don't like and things like that, if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. It does. So I know the workload in high school is way different from college, and I know that usually can contribute.
Most definitely. Whereas, they're doing things that they don't necessarily want to do.
Right.
To whereas college, you're doing things that you more want to do.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, in college, you do have your prereqs.
Which is similar.
Yeah, which is pretty similar, but it's not as heavy workload because pretty much, you start when you want to start your classes, morning, afternoon, evening, depending on the workload. If you shouldn't have as much work to do.
Right.
But between, that depends on if you're a full-time student or a part-time student, such as myself, part-time student, and go to work. In between me going to work and being a part-time student, only taking 2 classes right now, it's not as hard. But, I do see why now after graduating, and, I do see why kids usually drop out because, workload is too much. So it's usually, it's just too much schoolwork, too many due dates, too much work, everything due the next day,
Agreed.
and teachers don't really. Oh, some teachers do understand, but some teachers are just like, they don't really care. They're like, I don't care if you got housework to do or whatnot.
Yeah.
You're gonna turn it in tomorrow, and if you don't, then bam, I'll give you an F.
Yeah.
So do you feel like teachers nowadays, not that I should probably say this, but you think sometimes they do support some of their energy towards these kids dropping out because they're not really caring about students nowadays? Like, I shouldn't say supporting, but you know what I mean, contributing to their thoughts of dropping out.
I feel like it depends, because there's different teachers, different, like, you could set them in different categories.
Right.
Whereas, like I said, I went to 3 different high schools, and it didn't work in my third one. Then missed about a few months of school, then afterwards came back, and that's where I met you.
Mm-hmm.
And then did much better.
Right.
And so I say, like, there's some teachers that want to see students be successful and
Right.
finish high school
Mm-hmm.
more strongly, but I feel like there's other teachers that
They're just there to teach. They're not there
they're
to
there
really
to teach,
care for the
exactly.
student and whatnot.
Yeah, they're showing that maybe they might be new to doing what they do,
Yeah.
or even they got busy lives themselves, grading
Mhm.
papers or things going on outside of work.
Right.
And so I believe it just all depends on the teachers themselves.
I didn't know any teens with possessions when I was growing up. And as far as today, if they're taught responsibility and they have the means to have possessions, then that's great.
But how do you think it's affecting?
It depends on how they're raised. It doesn't have to affect them if they're raised responsibly and understand that having something means you work for it and you take care of it.
Right.
If they're just giving things, it could be a negative effect on them.
So this generation now, from what I've read, it seems like teens or young children are getting more and more things without hardly working for it, so they grow up not wanting to work for anything, just take everything for granted or believe they don't have to work for anything that the world owes them. So how would you feel, or how do you feel towards that?
I can see that people want the easy way out, but it's not always the best. But that seems to be the mentality. We want what we want now and the quickest, easiest way to get it instead of working hard for it.
So just taking shortcuts?
Yeah, I think that's the preference.
Okay. So when you were growing up, what was it like for you at all when it came to wanting things? Or
Well, I grew up with the understanding that we couldn't have everything. I grew up where we didn't have a lot. We had what we needed, and anything more was a privilege. I mean, it was enjoyed and taken care of, but we understood what our parents had and what we could have, and you dealt with it.
so it was a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it is. I mean, things are different now than they were then anyway. So, yeah. I have more than my parents had, so I'm able to give more. And so on and so on.